They laughed at the widow when she lit a fire pit, until they understood why. Dorothy Mitchell trembled more from nerves than from the cold as she stacked the last log onto the perfect circle she had built all afternoon. The 58-year-old widow knew the neighbors in the small community of Lake Placid in rural Colorado would soon start talking about her strange activity, but she no longer cared about the gossip. When the first flames began to dance around the wooden cabin she had inherited from her husband Walter, the neighbors came out of their homes to watch the unusual spectacle. It was almost midnight, and snow fell gently over the mountain region, creating a striking contrast between the orange fire and the crystalline white covering the ground. "Dorothy has finally lost her mind," murmured Mrs. Eleanor, the closest neighbor, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders as she watched from her kitchen window. "Who does something like this in the middle of the night?" The murmur spread quickly among the surrounding houses. The widow seemed oblivious to the comments, walking slowly around the circle of fire with a bucket in her hands, checking that all the flames were burning evenly. Her dark grey coat stood out against the snow, and the shawl covering her brown hair fluttered slightly in the mountain's icy wind. Walter Mitchell had passed away 2 years ago, a victim of a heart problem no one expected. He left Dorothy not only with longing, but also the responsibility of caring for the rural property he had bought with such effort years before. The wooden cabin, built by her husband's own hands, was situated on one of the highest parts of the region, surrounded by native pine trees with a privileged view of the valley. "Mum, what are you doing?" Jennifer's voice echoed across the property as Dorothy's eldest daughter came running up the trail leading to the cabin. The 35-year-old lawyer had received an urgent call from Mrs. Eleanor, alerting her to her mother's strange behavior. Dorothy didn't answer immediately. She kept walking around the flames, checking each log, each small ember that jumped toward the snow. Jennifer stopped at the edge of the fire circle, breathless from running up the hill, trying to understand what she was seeing. "Mom, answer me. All the neighbors are worried. Mrs. Eleanor said you've been acting strange for days." "What I do on my property is nobody's business," Dorothy finally replied, without stopping her walk. "And I'm not acting strange. I'm doing what needs to be done." Jennifer watched her mother with growing concern. In recent months, since completing 2 years of widowhood, Dorothy had become more reserved, spending long hours alone in the cabin and avoiding the community social gatherings she once attended regularly. Her daughter had attributed this change to natural grief, but now she began to wonder if something deeper was happening. "What needs to be done, Mom? Lighting a fire in the middle of the night? You could start a wildfire. We're in a preserved forest area." Dorothy stopped for the first time since Jennifer arrived. She looked directly at her daughter, her brown eyes reflecting the flames dancing around her. There was a determination in that gaze that Jennifer hadn't seen in a long time, an intensity that reminded her of the days when her mother fought to build a decent life alongside her father. "Jennifer, I know you don't understand now, but I need you to trust me. This fire must stay lit for 3 days and 3 nights straight. I can't explain more than that right now." "3 days? Mom, that's dangerous and it doesn't make sense. What would Dad say if he knew you were doing this?" Dorothy Mitchell's expression softened for a moment at the mention of her husband. She delicately touched the necklace she always wore, a small silver cross that Walter had given her on their wedding day 30 years earlier. "Your father would understand perfectly," she murmured, resuming her walk around the fire. "In fact, he was the one who taught me how to do this." Jennifer was confused. Her entire life, she had never seen her father do anything like this. Walter Mitchell had been a practical, hard-working man who dedicated his life to his family and the small rural property where they raised a few head of cattle and grew vegetables for their own consumption. What kind of knowledge could he have had about fire circles? The sound of footsteps on the trail interrupted Jennifer's thoughts. Mrs. Eleanor was approaching, accompanied by her husband, Mr. Harold, and 2 other neighbors. They all wore heavy coats and worried expressions. "Dorothy, dear, what is going on here?" asked Mrs. Eleanor in a soft voice as one speaks to a frightened child. "We are all worried about you." "There's no need to worry," replied Dorothy, maintaining her ritual walk. I'm just taking care of a personal matter." Mr. Harold, a practical 70-year-old man who had known the family for decades, shook his head in disapproval. "Dorothy, this isn't normal. You're playing with fire, literally. What if the wind spreads the flames to the woods? You could cause a tragedy." "The fire is controlled within my property and away from the trees," she replied patiently. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Jennifer felt a tightness in her chest, seeing her mother's almost obsessive determination. Over the last 2 years, she had noticed Dorothy spending hours studying some old notebooks she had found among her father's belongings, but she had never paid it any mind. Now she began to wonder if those notebooks contained information she was unaware of. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. The first night passed slowly. Jennifer decided to stay with her mother, even without understanding her reasons. She settled on the cabin porch, watching Dorothy feed the flames with new logs whenever necessary. The widow seemed to know exactly the point at which each section of the circle needed more fuel. "Mom, at least tell me where you learned this," insisted Jennifer for the 10th time, wrapped in a thick blanket. "From your father," replied Dorothy, as if it were obvious. "Walter knew many things you never imagined." Jennifer remembered the conversations her parents had when they thought their daughters weren't paying attention. Conversations in low voices, almost whispers, about subjects she had never fully deciphered. At the time, she had assumed they were just practical matters of adult life, but now she began to suspect there were family secrets she had never been part of. When the sun rose over the mountains, illuminating the snow that still covered the landscape, the circle of fire continued to burn intensely. The temperature had risen a few degrees around the area, warmed by the flames, creating a small oasis of warmth in the middle of the harsh winter. Jennifer had fallen asleep in the porch chair and woke to the sound of agitated voices. Dorothy was still walking around the fire, but now she was accompanied by at least 12 neighbors who had gathered to try to convince her to stop what they called madness. "Dorothy, this has gone too far," declared Mrs. Mildred, a 65-year-old woman who considered herself the moral leader of the community. "You are setting a terrible example for the children in the area. And you're wasting firewood that could be used to heat your home during the winter," added Mr. Eugene, a practical neighbor who always commented on household economy. Dorothy stopped and faced the small group that had formed around her property. Her expression was serene but firm. "Everyone minds their own business, and I mind mine," she said calmly. "This is my land, my firewood, and my decision." "But Dorothy, dear, we've known each other for so long," insisted Mrs. Eleanor, trying a more affectionate approach. "You've always been a sensible woman. This isn't like you." "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think," replied Dorothy, resuming her circular walk. Jennifer got up from the chair, still sleepy, and approached the group of neighbors. She felt torn between defending her mother and admitting that she too was worried about her behavior. "She said she's going to keep the fire burning for 3 days, Jennifer explained to the group. "She claims she learned it from my father, but I never saw him do anything like it." Mr. Harold scratched his gray beard, thoughtful. "Funny you should mention Walter. Now that I think about it, I do remember seeing him doing some strange things here on the property a few years back. I never quite understood what it was, but he was always tinkering with fire one way or another." This revelation surprised Jennifer. If her father really did something similar, why had he never mentioned it to the family? "What kind of strange things, Mr. Harold?" she asked. The elderly man looked thoughtfully at the circle of fire that continued to burn. "Well, 2 or 3 times a year, always in the winter, I'd see smoke coming from your property at night. I thought it was just firewood for heating, but now that I see this, there was something different. Walter would burn things in specific shapes, kind of organized." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Jennifer wanted to know. "Because it wasn't any of my business," replied Mr. Harold, shrugging. "Walter was a private man, but he was always a good neighbor. If he was doing something on his property, he must have had his reasons." This information completely changed Jennifer's perspective on the situation. If her father really did something similar, perhaps her mother wasn't losing her mind, but rather following some tradition or knowledge that had gone unnoticed by the family. "Mom," called Jennifer, approaching the edge of the fire circle. "Can you at least show me where Dad kept the information about this? There must be notes, explanations." Dorothy hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded affirmatively. "After the sun sets, I can show you some of his notebooks. But for now I need to focus on keeping the fire at the right temperature." "The right temperature for what?" insisted Jennifer. "For it to work," replied Dorothy enigmatically, offering no further details. The group of neighbors gradually dispersed throughout the morning, but not before making it clear they would continue to watch the situation. Some left shaking their heads in disapproval, others murmuring comments about the widow losing her sanity. Jennifer decided to cancel her professional appointments for the day and stay with her mother. She called the law office where she worked in Denver, explaining she had a family emergency to handle. During the afternoon, she watched fascinated as Dorothy seemed to know instinctively the exact moment to add more fuel to the fire. The widow didn't consult a clock or use any measuring instrument, but the flames remained constant and uniform throughout the entire circle. "How do you know when to add more wood?" asked Jennifer. "Your father taught me to observe the colors of the flames," explained Dorothy, pointing to a small section where the fire was slightly lower. "When the color changes from orange to light yellow, it's time to feed it again." Jennifer watched closely and realized her mother was right. There were subtle differences in the hue of the flames that indicated the intensity of the heat. This level of technical knowledge about fire wasn't something an ordinary person would naturally possess. When night fell again, Jennifer helped her mother carry more wood from the carefully organized pile that Dorothy had prepared in the previous days. That's when she noticed something that had gone unnoticed. The firewood was separated by different types of wood, each apparently intended for specific moments of the burn. "Mom, why did you separate the wood this way?" "Different woods burn at different temperatures," Dorothy explained patiently. "Eucalyptus to start, pine to maintain, and araucaria for the most critical moments." Jennifer was impressed by the level of planning behind what she had assumed was an impulsive act. She was beginning to understand that there was a scientific methodology behind her mother's actions, even if she still didn't understand the ultimate goal. When the second night progressed, Dorothy finally kept her promise to show her late husband's notebooks. She took Jennifer to the makeshift office that Walter kept in one of the cabin's rooms. "Your father was more studious than you imagined," said Dorothy, opening a wooden chest that contained dozens of handwritten notebooks. "He researched the thermal properties of soil for over 20 years. Jennifer picked up one of the notebooks and flipped through the pages covered in detailed notes, complex diagrams, and mathematical calculations she didn't understand. Her father's careful handwriting revealed a side of him she had never known. "He was self-taught in several areas," Dorothy continued. "Botany, chemistry, geology. He always said he would teach me everything when the right time came." "And when would the right time be?" Dorothy looked out the window toward the fire circle that continued burning. "Now. 20 years after he started this project." Jennifer flipped through a few more notebooks, finding detailed diagrams of fire circles in different configurations. Some were small, others enormous. All contained precise calculations about temperature, burn time, and expected results. "Mom, what kind of project was this?" "Your father discovered something very important about this specific land," explained Dorothy, sitting in an old chair beside the study table. "Something that could help many people, but that needed time and care to be developed." Jennifer felt she was finally getting to the heart of the matter, but important pieces of the puzzle were still missing. "What kind of discovery?" Dorothy hesitated, clearly debating internally how much she should reveal. "He discovered that this specific area of our property has unique soil and temperature characteristics that can be used to cultivate very rare medicinal plants, plants that cannot be grown anywhere else in the region." "Medicinal plants?" "Yes. Species that your grandparents knew and used to treat various health problems, but that were lost over the years because no one knew how to cultivate them properly." Jennifer began to understand the magnitude of what her mother was trying to accomplish. If it were true that her father had discovered a method for cultivating rare medicinal plants, it could truly have a significant impact on the local community. "And the fire circle is part of the cultivation process?" "It's the most important part," Dorothy confirmed. The soil needs to be heated in a specific way at a constant temperature for exactly 3 days. This creates the necessary conditions for the seeds to germinate when spring arrives. Jennifer looked at the notebooks again, now with a different understanding. The father's detailed notes weren't mere scientific curiosity, but serious research with practical application. "Why did you never tell us about this before?" "Because your father made me promise I would only reveal the secret if I was sure I could complete the project alone," answered Dorothy. "He didn't want to create false expectations in the family or the community. And now you're sure?" Dorothy looked out the window again, where the flames continued to dance against the darkness of the night. "Now I have no choice. This is the 20th year of his project. If I don't do it now, all his research will have been in vain." Jennifer spent the night reading her father's notebooks, trying to understand the scientific complexity behind the project. She discovered that Walter had meticulously documented every attempt, every failure, every small progress over 2 decades of research. When the second day dawned, Jennifer had a completely different view of the situation. Her mother wasn't going crazy. She was trying to honor 20 years of her husband's scientific work. "Mum, why didn't you explain this to the neighbors from the start?" "Because they wouldn't understand," replied Dorothy, checking the intensity of the flames once more. "And because there's still a chance it might not work. If it fails, I'd rather they think I'm crazy than know I failed to complete your father's work." Jennifer understood her mother's emotional dilemma. Carrying alone the responsibility for 2 decades of research was an enormous burden, especially for someone still dealing with grief. "You're not alone in this," said Jennifer, gently touching her mother's arm. "Now that I know, we'll complete this project together." Dorothy smiled for the first time since she had lit the circle of fire. It was a small smile, but Jennifer could see the relief in her eyes. "Thank you, daughter. I was beginning to think I couldn't do it." During the second day, some neighbors returned to check if Dorothy had given up on her strange activity. They were surprised to find Jennifer helping her mother keep the fire going. "Jennifer, are you going crazy too?" asked Mrs. Eleanor, clearly shocked. "No, Mrs. Eleanor, I'm helping my mother with an important project," replied Jennifer calmly. "A project my father started 20 years ago." This explanation didn't satisfy the neighbors, who remained skeptical about Dorothy's mental sanity. Some began talking about calling the local authorities to intervene. "You're playing with fire, literally," insisted Mrs. Mildred. "This is dangerous for the whole community." Jennifer decided it was time to reveal at least part of the truth. "My father was a self-taught researcher. He discovered a method for cultivating rare medicinal plants using specific soil heating techniques. My mother is trying to complete his research." The neighbors exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether to believe the explanation. "Walter never said anything about research," said Mr. Harold, shaking his head. "Because he was private and wanted to be sure it would work before telling anyone," explained Jennifer. "But he documented everything in detailed notebooks." Mrs. Eleanor remained skeptical. "Even if that's true, it doesn't explain why Dorothy needs to do this in the middle of the night, scaring the whole neighborhood." "Because the process needs to be done in winter, when the natural soil temperature is low," explained Jennifer, drawing on what she had read in her father's notebooks. "And it needs to be kept constant for 3 consecutive days." This technical explanation began to lessen the neighbors' hostility, though some still remained skeptical. Mr. Harold seemed especially interested in the possibility that Walter was a researcher. "Now that you mention it, I remember that Walter was always collecting different plants around the area," he commented thoughtfully. "And he'd ask strange questions about the herbs my grandmother used to make medicinal teas." Jennifer felt she was making progress in convincing the neighbors that there was a rational explanation for her mother's behavior. Exactly. He was documenting traditional knowledge and trying to find ways to cultivate those plants consistently. Mrs. Mildred, still reluctant to accept the explanation, made one last objection. "Even if that's true, why can't Dorothy wait until next winter? Why does it have to be right now?" Jennifer looked at her mother, who was focused on feeding a section of the fire that seemed to be weakening. "Because this is the 20th year of the project. According to my father's notes, this is the moment when all the factors will align for the experiment to work." The neighbors gradually dispersed again, some still skeptical, but others beginning to accept that perhaps there was a sensible explanation for Dorothy's strange activity. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. On the second day in the afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the property. A young man of about 30, wearing field clothes and carrying a heavy backpack, approached the fire circle with a curious expression. "Excuse me," he said respectfully to Dorothy. "I'm Brian Thompson, a botany student at Colorado State University. I'm doing field research in the area and noticed this fire from a distance. May I ask what you're doing?" Jennifer and Dorothy exchanged glances. The presence of a university researcher could be an opportunity or a complication, depending on how he reacted to explanations about the project. "I'm completing research that my late husband started," Dorothy replied carefully. "Research on cultivating medicinal plants." Brian was immediately interested. He moved closer to the fire circle and began observing the setup in detail. "What kind of medicinal plants? And what cultivation technique is this?" Jennifer decided to intervene, showing some of her father's notebooks she had brought from the cabin. "My father was self-taught, but he documented everything meticulously. He discovered that certain rare medicinal plants need specific soil temperature conditions to germinate." Brian examined the notes with growing interest. His expression gradually changed from casual curiosity to genuine scientific fascination. "These notes are impressively detailed," he remarked, turning the pages carefully. "His calculations about temperature and exposure time are more precise than much academic research I've seen." Dorothy stepped closer, clearly encouraged by the young researcher's positive reaction. "My husband spent 20 years studying this subject. He believed this specific area of our property had unique characteristics that would allow us to cultivate plants that don't grow anywhere else in the region." "What kind of plants specifically?" Dorothy hesitated for a moment, but then decided to trust the young researcher. "Plants our ancestors used for common health problems, but that were lost because no one could cultivate them reliably. Herbs for digestive issues, respiratory problems, joint pain." Brian grew increasingly interested. He asked permission to take some basic soil temperature measurements around the fire circle. "Would you allow me to collect some samples for analysis? This is truly fascinating from a scientific standpoint." Jennifer looked questioningly at her mother, who nodded positively. "Of course, but it can't interfere with the process. Only today and tomorrow to complete the 3 days." Brian spent the rest of the afternoon taking measurements and notes. He used a digital thermometer to check the soil temperature at different points around the circle, and was impressed by the precision of the method used by Dorothy. "Incredible," he murmured, recording the data. "The temperature is being maintained exactly in the range that would be ideal for germinating seeds of rare temperate plants. How do you achieve this precision without instruments?" "My husband taught me to observe the colors of the flames and the texture of the smoke," explained Dorothy. "Each subtle change indicates when and where to add more fuel." Brian was impressed by the empirical knowledge demonstrated by the widow. It was clear that, although self-taught, Walter had developed a sophisticated understanding of the scientific principles involved in the project. "May I ask what seeds you intend to plant?" Dorothy went to the cabin and returned with a small vial containing seeds of unusual appearance. "My husband collected these over 20 years, from plants found in remote locations in the mountains. He believed they were descendants of species our ancestors cultivated, but that had nearly disappeared." Brian examined the seeds with a magnifying glass he carried in his backpack. "Some of these seeds appear to be from species I've only seen in historical herbariums," he commented, clearly excited. "If you can successfully cultivate them, it would be a significant discovery for regional botany." This scientific validation was an enormous relief for Dorothy, who had carried alone the responsibility and doubts about her husband's project. "So you think it can really work?" "Based on your husband's notes and the measurements I took today, I'd say you have a real chance of success," Brian answered honestly. "The method is scientifically sound, even if it's unconventional." Jennifer felt a wave of pride for her father. Throughout her life, she had seen Walter as a simple, hard-working man, but she had never imagined he was capable of developing valid scientific research. "Brian, would you like to follow the rest of the process?" she asked. "It would be valuable to have an official researcher documenting what happens." Brian enthusiastically accepted the proposal. He set up his small camping tent near the cabin and began helping Dorothy and Jennifer maintain the fire during the second night. During the quiet hours of the early morning, the three talked at length about the traditional medicinal plants of the region. Brian shared academic knowledge about botany, while Dorothy told stories she had learned from her mother and grandmother about the traditional uses of plants. "My grandmother knew at least 20 different plants that could be used for common health problems," Dorothy recounted. "But when she died, much of that knowledge was lost because we, the younger generation, didn't value it at the time." "That's exactly what's happening all over the country," Brian commented sadly. "Traditional knowledge about medicinal plants is disappearing faster than we can document it scientifically." Jennifer began to understand that her father's project had much larger implications than she had initially imagined. It wasn't just about honoring his memory, but about preserving valuable knowledge that was being lost. "If this project works, you would be contributing to preserving an important part of traditional American medicine," Brian added. When the third day dawned, a small crowd had gathered near the property. The news about the scientific research had spread quickly through the community, and many people were curious to see the final result. Mrs. Eleanor approached with an expression very different from the hostility she had shown in previous days. "Dorothy, I'm sorry for thinking you were losing your mind," she said sincerely. "The young Brian explained to us that this is a serious scientific project." "It's quite all right, Eleanor," Dorothy replied graciously. "I understand it seemed strange without context." Mr. Harold also approached, this time with respect. "Dorothy, I wanted to tell you that I always knew Walter was special. Now I understand why he asked all those questions about the plants in the region." Throughout the morning, several people from the community offered to help keep the fire going during the final hours. It was moving to see how the discovery about the scientific project had transformed the neighborhood's perception of Dorothy's actions. Brian continued taking measurements and documenting the entire process. He explained to the curious onlookers that it was an advanced soil preparation technique for cultivating rare species. "What impresses me most is the precision of the method developed by Mr. Walter," he said to a group of neighbors. "He achieved results that many university laboratories would have difficulty replicating." In the late afternoon of the third day, the time came to extinguish the fire. Dorothy allowed the flames to die out naturally, without adding more fuel. Gradually, the perfect circle of fire turned into embers, then into still warm ashes. The soil where the fire had burned showed a distinct dark coloration, clearly altered by prolonged exposure to heat. Brian measured the final temperature and confirmed it was exactly within the range predicted by Walter's notes. "Now comes the most important part," said Dorothy, picking up the vial with the seeds. "If my husband's method is correct, these seeds must be planted while the soil is still warm." With careful and deliberate movements, Dorothy began planting the seeds in organized rows within the circle that had been heated by the fire. Brian helped her, offering scientific guidance on spacing and planting depth. Jennifer watched, moved, as her mother completed the work her father had planned for 20 years. It was a deeply meaningful moment, not just for the family but for the entire community that had witnessed the process. "And now what happens?" asked Mrs. Eleanor. "Now we wait until spring," replied Dorothy, carefully covering the last seed with the dark soil. "If Walter's method works, these seeds will germinate when the weather warms up." Brian explained to the curious neighbors that germination would likely occur in September or October, when the natural temperatures became more favorable. "It will be a gradual process," he said. "First, small green shoots will appear, then young plants, and finally, if all goes well, mature plants producing the medicinal substances we seek." The entire community was fascinated by the possibility of witnessing the rebirth of traditional medicinal plants. Several people offered to help care for the site in the following months. Dorothy thanked everyone but explained that she preferred to personally oversee the project, at least until she was sure it was working properly. "This was my husband's dream for 20 years, she said emotionally. "I want to make sure it comes true the way he planned it." In the weeks that followed, Dorothy visited the site where she had planted the seeds daily. She watered carefully when necessary and protected the area from animals that might damage the future plants. Jennifer returned to her work in Denver, but called every day to check on the project's progress. Brian kept in touch as well, offering scientific guidance whenever needed. The shift in the community's perception of Dorothy was dramatic. From a widow who was losing her mind, she transformed into a respected citizen scientist, contributing to the preservation of traditional knowledge. Mrs. Eleanor became one of the project's biggest supporters, visiting regularly to offer help and share knowledge about medicinal plants she had learned from her own family. "You know, Dorothy, my great-grandmother also knew many plants for making remedies," she shared during a visit. "Perhaps I can help identify some of the plants when they grow." Mr. Harold brought additional seeds he had saved from plants his grandmother grew in her backyard decades ago. "If Walter's method works with his plants, maybe it will work with these too," he suggested hopefully. Dorothy accepted the additional seeds, but explained she preferred to first test the ones her husband had specifically selected. If the project was successful, they could expand to include other species in the following years. 2 months after planting in August, Dorothy noticed the first signs of germination. Tiny green sprouts began to appear in the dark soil where she had planted the seeds. She immediately called Jennifer with the news. "Jennifer, it worked. The seeds are sprouting." Jennifer cancelled her appointments and drove immediately to Lake Placid to see the first sprouts with her own eyes. When she arrived, she found her mother kneeling beside the circle, watching fascinated as the small signs of life emerged from the earth. "Mom, Dad would be so proud," said Jennifer, moved. "I feel as if he is here with us," replied Dorothy, gently touching one of the sprouts. All these years of research were finally worth it. Brian also came to check the progress and was impressed with the germination rate. "This is extraordinary," he commented, taking detailed photographs of the sprouts. "The success rate is far higher than would be expected for such rare seeds." In the following weeks, the sprouts grew rapidly. Brian identified several different species, some of which he recognized from historical descriptions of traditional medicinal plants. "You are literally bringing back plants that haven't been seen in the region for decades," he said excitedly. "This is a milestone in local biodiversity preservation." The news of the project's success spread beyond the local community. Researchers from the university where Brian studied became interested in visiting the property to officially document the discovery. "Would you like me to arrange a visit from some professors?" asked Brian. "They are very interested in studying the method your husband developed." Dorothy initially hesitated, worried that academic attention might complicate the project, but Jennifer encouraged her to accept. "Mom, Dad would have been honored to know his work is being recognized by the scientific community." Dorothy agreed, on the condition that any further research respected the project's original goals, to preserve and make traditional medicinal plants available to the local community. In September, when the young plants were well established, a delegation of 3 university professors visited the property. They were impressed both by the methodology developed by Walter and by the results achieved by Dorothy. "This is a perfect example of citizen science," remarked Dr. Richard Parker, professor of botany. "Rigorous research developed outside the traditional academic environment, but with scientifically valid results." Dr. Margaret Sullivan, an expert in medicinal plants, was particularly interested in the species being cultivated. "Some of these plants were not documented in modern scientific literature," she said. "You are helping to fill important gaps in our knowledge of the regional medicinal flora." Dr. Charles Anderson, an expert in cultivation methods, requested permission to document in detail the technique developed by Walter. "We would like to publish a scientific article about this method, properly crediting Mr. Walter's work," he proposed. This could help other researchers replicate the technique in different regions. Dorothy agreed, feeling this would be the best way to honor her husband's memory and ensure his research benefited as many people as possible. During October, the plants began to produce their first mature leaves. Dr. Margaret returned to collect samples and perform chemical analyses to confirm the presence of the expected medicinal compounds. "The preliminary results are very promising," she reported a few weeks later. The plants are producing the active compounds in concentrations suitable for medicinal use. This scientific confirmation was the moment Dorothy had waited for 2 years. Walter's project was not only a scientific success, but also had real practical application. Jennifer decided to leave her job in Denver to dedicate herself full-time to the family project. With her background in law, she could help navigate the legal and regulatory issues involved in producing and distributing medicinal plants. "Mom, what if we turn this into something bigger?" she suggested. "We could establish a community cooperative to cultivate and process these medicinal plants." The idea excited Dorothy, who had always dreamed that her husband's work would benefit the entire community, not just their family. Mrs. Eleanor offered to help organize the families interested in joining the cooperative. "Many people in the region have experience with medicinal plants," she said. "We could combine Walter's scientific method with the traditional knowledge that still exists in the community." Mr. Harold offered a portion of his property to expand the cultivation. "If the method works on Dorothy's land, it will probably work on mine too," he reasoned, "and I would like to contribute to perpetuating my neighbor's work." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. By the end of November, the plants were sufficiently mature for the first experimental harvest. Dr. Margaret supervised the process, teaching Dorothy and Jennifer the correct harvesting and processing techniques to preserve the medicinal compounds. "It's important to harvest at the right time of day and process immediately," she explained. "The potency of the active compounds varies according to the time and weather conditions. The first harvest produced enough material to prepare teas and extracts for about 20 families in the community. Dorothy decided to distribute these first products for free as a way to test their efficacy and collect user feedback. Mrs. Eleanor was one of the first to try the tea made from the plants cultivated by Walter's method. "Dorothy, this is exactly like the tea my grandmother used to make for joint pain," she said emotionally. "The taste, the smell, everything is the same. You have truly brought back something we thought was lost forever." Other neighbors reported similar experiences. "Plants for digestive, respiratory, and muscular problems that your grandmothers used to use were available again, produced with consistent quality and potency." The local success caught the attention of other researchers and rural communities. Brian organized visits from delegations interested in learning the method to apply in their own regions. "You've created a model that can be replicated across the country," he said enthusiastically. "Imagine if every rural community could recover their traditional medicinal plants using valid scientific techniques." In December, exactly 1 year after Dorothy had lit the first fire circle, the community organized a special celebration to mark the project's success. The mayor of Lake Placid attended the event and announced that the municipality would officially support the expansion of the initiative. "The work started by Mr. Walter Mitchell and completed by Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell represents the best of our community," he said in his speech. "The combination of traditional knowledge with scientific methods is exactly what we need to preserve our cultural heritage." Representatives from other towns in the region were also present, interested in establishing similar projects in their communities. Dr. Margaret Sullivan announced that the university was establishing a formal partnership with the cooperative being created, offering ongoing technical and scientific support. "This project represents a new model of collaboration between academic knowledge and community wisdom," she explained. "We hope it serves as an example for similar initiatives across the country." Brian, who had completed his master's degree using the project as a case study, was invited to coordinate the expansion program to other regions. "The method developed by Mr. Walter can be adapted for different soil types and climates," he said. Each region could cultivate the medicinal plants specific to its local tradition. Jennifer settled permanently on the family property, transforming part of the cabin into an office to manage the legal and administrative aspects of the cooperative. The property where Dorothy had lit the fire circle became a research and education center for traditional medicinal plants. Schools from across the region brought students to learn about botany, cultural preservation, and sustainable farming methods. Dorothy became a respected speaker, sharing the project's story at universities, conferences, and community events. The most important thing I learned in this process is that we should never give up on our dreams, even when other people don't understand, she always said at the end of her talks. My husband dreamed of this for 20 years, and I almost gave up out of fear of others' judgment. The story of the widow who was ridiculed for lighting a fire circle became an inspiring legend in the region. Parents told their children how Dorothy had the courage to complete her husband's work, even while facing misunderstanding and criticism. The project continued to grow and develop in the following years. New plant species were identified and cultivated. Processing techniques were refined. The cooperative expanded to include dozens of families. Dorothy often visited the place where she had lit the first fire circle, now transformed into a thriving garden of medicinal plants. She would sit on the wooden bench Jennifer had installed there and talk quietly with her husband, sharing the project's news and successes. "Walter, you can't imagine how this has grown," she would murmur during these visits. "Your research is helping people in places we didn't even know about. You would be so proud." During one of these visits, Jennifer found her mother smiling as she watched a group of local school children learning about the plants. "Mom, you know you transformed the life of this entire community, right?" "It wasn't me," Dorothy replied humbly. "It was your father. I just had the courage to trust in his work when everyone thought I was crazy. But you were the one who faced the criticism and completed the project. Daddy would have been so proud of your courage." Dorothy touched the necklace she always wore again, thinking of her husband and how life had changed since that cold night when she lit the first fire circle. "You know what makes me happiest," she finally said. "It's knowing that other people won't have to go through what we went through. When someone gets sick now, we have options. If we have the plants our grandparents knew but produced safely and reliably." Jennifer agreed, watching the steady flow of people visiting the medicinal plant center that had developed around the property. "And it all started because you had the courage to do something others didn't understand. Sometimes you have to accept being misunderstood to do the right thing," Dorothy reflected. "The important thing is to never give up on what we know is true." In the years that followed, the method developed by Walter and implemented by Dorothy was replicated in more than 50 rural communities across the United States. Thousands of families regained access to traditional medicinal plants that had been lost over generations. Universities from other countries became interested in the American model of preserving traditional knowledge through scientific methods. Delegations from Canada, Mexico, and Honduras visited Lake Placid to learn about the project. Brian earned his doctorate studying the international applications of the method and established an exchange program to teach the technique to indigenous and rural communities in North America. Dr. Margaret Sullivan published several scientific papers on the rediscovered plants, contributing to the world's knowledge of traditional medicine. Dr. Richard Parker established a specific university course on citizen science and traditional knowledge preservation, using Walter and Dorothy's project as the main case study. Jennifer specialized in environmental law and helped establish specific legislation to protect and promote traditional medicinal plant preservation initiatives. The local cooperative became a respected social enterprise, supplying medicinal plant products to pharmacies and natural product stores throughout the state. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the lives of the people who met Dorothy and witnessed her journey. Hundreds of people learned that it's possible to turn criticism and misunderstanding into motivation to accomplish something important. Mrs. Eleanor became one of the main advocates for innovative community projects, always reminding people not to quickly judge what they don't understand. "Dorothy taught me that sometimes the people who seem to be doing strange things are the ones who are really making a difference," she used to say. Mr. Harold documented his own experience with traditional medicinal plants and helped several families in the region recover knowledge that was being lost. "If Walter managed to do this alone, imagine what we can do working together," he would tell his neighbors. The project also had a profound impact on Dorothy's personal life. The work of completing her husband's research helped her process her grief in a constructive and meaningful way. "Working on the project allowed me to feel that Walter is still present in my life," she explained in an interview years later. "Every plant that grows is a continuation of his love and dedication. Jennifer discovered a passion for community work she never knew she had, and built a rewarding career helping rural communities preserve their traditional knowledge. "I used to think success meant having an important job in the city," she reflected. "But I discovered that true success is contributing to something bigger than yourself." Brian found his professional calling studying the intersection between academic science and traditional knowledge, becoming an international reference on the subject. "The Mitchells Project showed me that the greatest scientific advances can come from the most unexpected places," he said, while receiving an international award for his work. The story became study material in anthropology, sociology, and botany courses, demonstrating how scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom can be combined productively. Professors used the case to teach about the importance of keeping an open mind and not quickly judging behaviors that seem unusual. Students learned about perseverance, courage, and the importance of honoring the legacy left by previous generations. Researchers studied the model as an example of how communities can take control of their own cultural preservation without relying exclusively on external institutions. 10 years after Dorothy had lit that first circle of fire, Lake Placid became a destination for educational tourism, with people visiting specifically to see the Medicinal Plant Center and learn about the story that originated it. The cabin where Walter had developed his research was transformed into a museum, preserving his original notebooks and the tools he used to study the plants. The spot where Dorothy lit the circle of fire was marked with a simple but significant monument, a circle of stones with a plaque explaining the history of the project. Visitors often left flowers and small offerings at the site, inspired by the story of perseverance and scientific dedication. The cooperative's product store sold not only medicinal plants, but also books telling the complete story of the project and manuals teaching the method developed by Walter. Dorothy, at 68, still worked actively on the project, but now mainly as a mentor and advisor. She had trained dozens of young people to continue the technical work. "The most important thing I can teach the next generation is that they should not be afraid to seem different," she told the young researchers. "The best discoveries always come from people who are willing to try things others think are impossible." Jennifer took over the administrative leadership of the cooperative and was planning to expand the model to other American states. "Our goal is for every American child to have access to the natural remedies their great-grandparents knew," she declared at a national conference on traditional medicine. Brian had become a university professor but maintained close ties to the original project, returning regularly to guide new research. "This place taught me that true science doesn't only happen in laboratories," he told his students. "It happens anywhere where curious people ask important questions about the world." The original plants cultivated by Dorothy continued to thrive, now in their 10th generation. Some had adapted so well to the local environment that they began to reproduce naturally, ensuring their long-term preservation. New species continued to be discovered and tested, constantly expanding the catalogue of medicinal plants available to the community. Researchers from other countries established collaborative projects to exchange seeds and knowledge, creating an international network for preserving traditional medicinal plants. The economic impact on the region was also significant. The cooperative generated direct employment for over 100 families and stimulated the local economy through educational tourism and product sales. Young people who previously migrated to cities in search of opportunities now found rewarding careers working in cultural preservation and scientific research within their own community. The region became an example of sustainable development, combining environmental preservation, cultural appreciation, and economic prosperity. The project also influenced state and federal public policies related to traditional medicine and cultural knowledge preservation. Laws were passed facilitating the registration and commercialization of traditional medicinal plants cultivated through validated scientific methods. Government support programs for rural communities began to include specific funding for traditional knowledge preservation projects. Universities received incentives to develop partnerships with local communities in citizen science projects. But perhaps the project's most important legacy was the shift in people's mindset about the value of traditional knowledge and the importance of preserving ancestral wisdom. Thousands of families across the country began documenting and preserving knowledge that their grandmothers possessed about plants, cuisine, agriculture, and natural medicine. Schools incorporated curricula on local history and traditional knowledge, connecting children with their cultural roots. Television programs and documentaries highlighted the importance of valuing the wisdom of elders before it was lost. Dorothy's story inspired many people to face criticism and pursue projects they believed in, even when others did not understand. Support groups formed for people who wanted to develop innovative community projects but feared social judgment. Workshops were organized to teach people how to combine family traditional knowledge with modern scientific methods. 20 years after that night, when Dorothy lit her first fire circle, the community organized a special celebration to mark the project's 20th anniversary. Hundreds of people attended, including families who had benefited from the medicinal plants, students who had learned about the project, and researchers who had used the model in their own communities. Dorothy, now 78 years old, addressed the crowd gathered at the place where it all began. "When I lit that first fire, I only wanted to honor my husband's memory," she said with emotion in her voice. "I never imagined it would become something so big and touch so many lives. But I learned that when we do something with love and dedication, even if it seems small or misunderstood at first, it can grow in ways we never expected. The most important thing is to never give up on what we know is right, even when others laugh at us or think we've gone crazy. Because sometimes the ideas that seem the craziest are the ones with the greatest potential to change the world for the better." The crowd applauded emotionally, many people crying as they remembered how their own lives had been transformed by the project. Jennifer, now a recognized authority in traditional knowledge preservation, spoke about future plans. "We will expand the model to 50 new municipalities in the next 5 years," she announced. "And we are developing a People's University focused exclusively on preserving traditional wisdom." Brian, who had received several international awards for his work, shared recent discoveries. "We have identified 30 more species of medicinal plants that can be recovered using variations of the method developed by Mr. Walter," he reported. Some had been considered extinct for decades. Dr. Margaret presented results from clinical studies confirming the efficacy of many plants cultivated by the project. "The medicinal compounds produced by these plants are as potent as their synthetic versions, but with fewer side effects," she explained. "We are literally rediscovering medicines that were lost." Representatives from other countries spoke about how they had implemented similar projects in their communities. A delegation from Guatemala reported success in recovering traditional Andean medicinal plants. Researchers from Kenya described how they adapted the method to preserve African traditional medicine knowledge. Indigenous groups from Nicaragua shared experiences using the technique to restore sacred plants that were disappearing. The project had become a global movement to preserve traditional knowledge through scientific methods, but at the heart of it all was still the simple story of a widow who had the courage to honor her husband's memory, even when everyone thought she had lost her mind. During the celebration, Dorothy visited the small local cemetery where Walter was buried. Jennifer accompanied her, carrying a bouquet made exclusively from plants that had been cultivated using his method. "Walter, you can't imagine what your work has become," murmured Dorothy, placing the flowers on the grave. "Thousands of people are being helped by the plants you studied for so many years. You always said you wanted to leave the world a little better than you found it. I think you've done that and much more." Jennifer watched her mother in silence, thinking about how life had changed since that night when she ran to the property, thinking her mother was losing her mind. "Mom, you know you're a hero to many people, right?" Dorothy smiled, touching the silver cross she still wore around her neck. "I just did what any wife would do. I trusted my husband and finished the work he started. But you did it while facing criticism and misunderstanding. Not everyone would have had that courage." "The courage came from love," Dorothy replied simply. "When we truly love someone, we find strengths we didn't even know we had." As they returned to the celebration, they found a group of children from the local school planting new seedlings in the experimental garden. A little girl about 8 years old approached Dorothy. "Mrs. Dorothy, Is it true that you saved the plants from extinction? Dorothy knelt to be at the child's level. Many people and I worked together to bring back important plants that were disappearing, she explained patiently. But the most important thing is that now you children know how to care for these plants so they never disappear again. And when I grow up, can I help too? Of course you can, dear. In fact, that's what we hope, that you will continue this work when we are no longer here. The simple conversation with the child touched Dorothy deeply. She realized that the project's true success was not just having recovered the plants, but having inspired a new generation to value and preserve traditional knowledge. As the celebration continued, Dorothy watched the different generations working together in the garden. Grandparents teaching grandchildren about plants their great-grandmothers knew, university students documenting traditional knowledge, children asking curious questions about botany and natural medicine. "You know what makes me happiest?" she said to Jennifer. "It's seeing that we created something that will last far beyond our lives. These children will teach their children, who will teach their grandchildren. Dad would be proud to know that his research not only recovered lost plants but also restored people's connection to their traditions," agreed Jennifer. As the sun set over the mountains of the Colorado Rockies, bringing the celebration to a close, Dorothy took one last walk around the spot where she had lit the first fire circle 20 years earlier. The garden was flourishing magnificently, with dozens of different species of medicinal plants growing vigorously. People of all ages walked along the paths, some gathering plants to prepare teas, others simply admiring the beauty and diversity of the vegetation. It was exactly the vision Walter had described in his notebooks, a place where traditional knowledge and modern science combined to benefit the entire community. Dorothy sat on the bench Jennifer had installed years before and watched the last people saying goodbye and heading to their homes. "Walter, we did it," she murmured softly. "Your dream came true in a way more beautiful than any of us could have imagined." As night fell over the valley, Dorothy remained seated, feeling the spiritual presence of her husband beside her and the deep satisfaction of having completed something truly meaningful. The project that began with a crazy widow lighting a fire in the early hours had transformed into a global movement of cultural preservation, benefiting thousands of families and inspiring countless people to pursue their own dreams, even when others did not understand. And all because one woman had the courage to trust in her husband's love and wisdom, even when everyone around her thought she had lost her mind. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this moving story of Dorothy and her determination to honor her husband's memory. Do you believe she made the right decision in facing criticism to complete Walter's project? We really want to know your opinion on this journey of love, science, and cultural preservation. Leave your honest comment, sharing how this story touched your heart, and don't forget to give it a like. Most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.